Margaret's hands trembled as she unfolded the brittle letter she found tucked inside her late husband's coat lining. The handwriting was familiar. But the name at the top wasn't. It was addressed to her sister. And as Margaret read the first line, "I never wanted you to know what she did." Her knees buckled. The world she thought she knew about her husband, her marriage, and her own family, it all began to unravel. Welcome back to Quiet Morning Tales. Stories for people who feel deeply. Stories about love, loss, and the quiet truths we only discover when life slows down. If you're here because you believe emotions matter, because you've lived enough life to know pain and healing come in waves, then settle in. Take a breath. This one is going to stay with you. Part 1: The House He Left Behind. Margaret Callahan had lived on Willow Bend Lane for 43 years, and in all that time, the rhythm of her days never changed much. Mornings were slow, quiet, just the way she liked them. She'd boil water for tea, let it steep too long like Harold always teased her about, then sit by the kitchen window watching the fog lift from the open fields behind their house, but for the last 8 months, that chair felt colder. The sunrise felt harsher. And the house felt too loud with silence. Her husband, Thomas Callahan, kind-eyed, gentle, steady, had passed quietly in his sleep one rainy night in March. A heart that loved too much finally wore itself out. Margaret had cleaned his clothes, boxed his tools, tucked away his reading glasses. She thought she had gone through everything. But grief has a way of hiding things, saving them for when you're just steady enough to fall apart again. That morning in November, the sky was a washed-out gray, the kind that seeps into your bones. Margaret shuffled around the house in wool socks and an old cardigan that still smelled faintly like lavender. She'd been sorting through winter coats, donate pile, keep pile, fix pile. Thomas's old navy blue coat was in the keep pile. She would never wear it but couldn't bear to let it go. She slipped her hands into the pockets. Lint. A few old receipts. A button. A tiny wooden bead from some craft project involving their niche years ago. And then something thin, crisp. Paper. Margaret frowned and reached deeper, fingers brushing against a corner. A folded letter. Tucked neatly, hidden inside the inner lining of the coat like someone had intentionally placed it there. Her heart stuttered. Thomas wasn't careless. If something was tucked into a lining, he put it there. She pulled it out slowly. The envelope was yellowed, edges soft. A faint scent of cedar clung to it. Thomas always kept cedar blocks in his closet. There was no stamp. No address. Just a name written in her husband's unmistakable handwriting. To Eleanor. Margaret's breath caught. Eleanor. Her sister. Her only sibling. The one she hadn't spoken to in 17 years. Chapter 2: The Sister She Lost. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the letter lying untouched before her. Steam from her tea curled upward, ghost-like, disappearing into the air. Her memories of Eleanor were complicated, warm in the beginning, icy toward the end. They had grown up sharing a bedroom, sharing secrets, sharing dreams. But adulthood had unraveled things between them. Little arguments that grew too sharp. Jealousies that never healed. A betrayal Margaret never fully understood but felt deeply. They'd stopped speaking the year her father passed away. A fight over something small. Funeral arrangements, flowers, money, who said what first. But the silence afterward grew like weeds. Eleanor never reached out. Margaret never tried either. And Thomas always told her gently, maybe someday, Maggie. Sisters find their way back. But someday never came. Margaret stared at the letter, questions pressing like stones against her chest. Why would Thomas write to Eleanor? Was it recent? Was it old? Was it about her? Was it about her father? Her fingers trembled. Thomas never hid anything from her. At least, she thought he hadn't. Chapter 3: What He Never Said. The kettle clicked as it cooled. The clock ticked louder than usual. Outside, a crow cawed like some omen. Margaret finally picked up the envelope with shaking hands. There was no seal. Just a flap folded inward. She ran her finger under it. For a moment, she hesitated. Feeling like she was prying into something private, something Thomas didn't want her to see. Then a steadying thought came. He loved me. He would have told me if he could. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, creased into thirds. She unfolded it, slowly, carefully, afraid it might crumble. Her eyes scanned the first line. And her stomach hollowed. I never wanted Margaret to know what you did. She gripped the table. A cold wave washed over her. The words blurred for a second, her vision swimming. Eleanor did something. Something Thomas knew about. Something he kept from her. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she read further. I promised her I'd protect her, even if it meant carrying this alone. Her breath caught. Protect her? From Eleanor? What had her sister done? What burden had Thomas been quietly shouldering all these years? She kept reading. Her fingers dug into the paper as if it would anchor her. But the day your actions nearly destroyed her, I made a choice. I handled it. I fixed it. And I will not let her carry the pain of knowing. Margaret felt the room tilt. Destroyed her? Handled what? Her mind spiraled through memories. The unexplained tension, her father's sudden change of tone around Eleanor before he died, a missing sum of money that was never explained, a distant cousin who stopped speaking to their family, none of it made sense. And then. At the bottom of the page, you may hate me for intervening, but I would do it again. For Margaret. Always. Thomas. Tears spilled before she even felt them. Thomas had done something big to protect her from Eleanor. Had sacrificed something. Had carried something heavy. He had kept her safe. But at what cost? Margaret pressed her palm to her mouth, shaking. The house suddenly felt colder, larger, emptier. Chapter 4: The Weight of Unasked Questions. She reread the letter 3 times, each pass hitting harder. Her husband wasn't dramatic. Wasn't cryptic. He didn't exaggerate. If he wrote, nearly destroyed her. He meant it. Margaret felt betrayed. Protected. Loved. Confused. All at once. A storm inside a quiet old woman's chest. She stood up abruptly, chair scraping the floor. Her hand shook as she set the letter down, pacing the kitchen. Why didn't he tell her? Why didn't Eleanor ever say anything? What had happened? What had he handled? When did this happen? Why was the letter never sent? Her thoughts collided like cars in thick fog. At one point, she whispered into the empty kitchen, Thomas, why didn't you trust me with this? But after a moment, she corrected herself softly. No, you were protecting me, weren't you? Her voice cracked. Chapter 5: The First Sacrifice Unknown. Margaret pressed her hand against the windowpane, staring at the lifeless November garden outside. Had she misunderstood her own life? Had Thomas been carrying a burden for her all these years while she simply went on cooking, gardening, knitting, living in her little bubble of trust? Had she missed the signs? The tiredness in his eyes some nights? The way he changed the subject whenever Eleanor came up? The way he always insisted Margaret focus on the good memories? Guilt hit her unexpectedly. How many nights had Thomas sat alone with the secret? How many times had he wanted to tell her? How many family gatherings, holidays, birthdays had been quietly shadowed by something he was shielding her from? Margaret sank slowly into her chair. Her heart ached. A physical, dull ache. As if the truth were bruising her from the inside. She whispered, barely audible, Thomas, my love, what did you give up for me? Chapter 6: The Box in the Closet. Margaret tucked the letter back into the envelope and placed it on the table as if it were made of glass. She needed answers. And she had one place left to look. Thomas's side of the closet. She hadn't touched it since he passed. other than to press her face into his sweaters on the hardest nights. She walked into the bedroom, feet slow, deliberate. The closet door creaked as she opened it. His shirts still hung neatly, the way he kept them, light to dark, short-sleeved to long. His boots were lined up, laces tucked inside, the smell of cedar and old leather wrapped around her. She reached to the top shelf, fingers brushing against a small wooden box she had never noticed before. Dark walnut. Polished smooth. No lock. Her pulse flickered, she pulled it down gently. Her hands hesitated because whatever was inside might change everything. But she had already stepped into the truth, there was no going back. She lifted the lid. Inside were a checkbook, a stack of letters, a manila folder and a small velvet pouch. She froze. This wasn't random, this was curated, intentional. A private archive of something Thomas never intended her to see unless he couldn't explain it himself. Her throat tightened. This was his sacrifice, his burden, his quiet protection, and no. It was hers. Chapter 7. The folder with her name on it. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, the wooden box resting on her knees like something alive. Her hands hovered over its contents, reluctant now, afraid of what certainty might bring. She reached for the manila folder first. It was thick. Heavy. Her name was written across the tab in Thomas's handwriting. Margaret Callahan. Her stomach tightened. Inside were bank statements, old ones, years old. She flipped through slowly, her eyes scanning numbers that made less sense the longer she looked. Withdrawals. Transfers. Amounts that didn't match anything she remembered paying for. $5,000. $10,000. $25,000. Her breath caught. They had lived modestly, carefully. Thomas was never reckless with money. They clipped coupons. Repaired things instead of replacing them. Skipped vacations when money felt tight. So where had this gone? She turned the page. A note was clipped to one statement. Final payment. Final payment for what? Her fingers trembled as she dug deeper into the folder. There. A photocopy of a loan agreement, not in her name, not even in Thomas's. It was in Eleanor's. Margaret's chest tightened so fast it hurt. Her sister, the same sister whose name was on the letter. Her eyes darted over the document. Debt. Large debt. Interest piling fast. A signature, unmistakably Eleanor's looping handwriting. And beneath it, a second signature. Thomas Callahan, not as borrower. As guarantor. Margaret gasped. Thomas had signed himself onto Eleanor's debt. Quietly. Legally. Completely without Margaret's knowledge. Chapter 8. The day everything shifted. Memory stirred. Margaret remembered the year this must have happened, the year Eleanor called crying late one night. The year Eleanor stopped visiting suddenly. The year Thomas had grown distant for a while, quieter than usual. Margaret had assumed it was stress. Or aging. Or worry over money. She never imagined it was this. Her mind raced backward. That Thanksgiving when Eleanor left early, eyes red. That Christmas when Eleanor didn't come at all. The unexplained tension between Thomas and her sister at their father's funeral. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. Margaret clutched the folder tighter, heart pounding. Her sister had been in serious trouble, financially ruined, drowning in something so big Thomas felt the need to step in. And he did. Without telling his wife. Without asking permission. Without ever expecting gratitude. Chapter 9. The letters he never sent. Margaret reached back into the box, fingers brushing over the stack of letters tied with twine. She untied them slowly. All addressed to Eleanor. None mailed. The first was dated 12 years ago. She unfolded it. Eleanor, I am doing this for Margaret, not for you. She deserves peace, not betrayal. I've taken care of the debt. It's finished. You will never contact her about this. If you ever put her at risk again, financially or emotionally, I won't be as quiet. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth. Her sister had betrayed her, not in some small, petty way. In a way that nearly destroyed their financial security. Margaret flipped to the next letter. You promised me you'd get help. I paid what I could, but you have to stay away. She asks about you sometimes. I tell her you're busy. It's easier than the truth. Tears slid down Margaret's cheeks, unchecked. Thomas had been lying. Not maliciously. Lovingly. He had chosen to become the villain in Eleanor's eyes if it meant Margaret stayed whole. Chapter 10 The Cost He Never Spoke of. Margaret went back to the bank statements. She noticed something else now, something she hadn't seen before. After the large withdrawals, there were smaller deposits. Regular ones, consistent. Every month. From an account she didn't recognize. Her heart skipped. Thomas had a second income. A hidden one. Her breath grew shallow as realization settled like ice. He hadn't just paid Eleanor's debt. He had worked to do it. Extra hours, side jobs. Work that exhausted him. She remembered now. The late nights. The excuses. The "I'll be home soon, Maggie." The sore back he brushed off, the way he sometimes fell asleep sitting upright in the recliner. She had assumed it was age. It wasn't. It was sacrifice. Chapter 11 The Velvet Pouch. Margaret's hands moved to the small velvet pouch at the bottom of the box. She loosened the drawstring. Inside was a ring. Not her wedding ring. Not something she'd ever seen before. A simple gold band. Engraved on the inside, "For the years I couldn't give you." Her knees buckled. Margaret collapsed onto the bed, clutching the ring like it might dissolve. Thomas had sold something. She knew it instantly. He had owned a vintage watch passed down from his father, a family heirloom he never wore but kept wrapped carefully in a drawer. She remembered asking once why he never wore it. Saving it, he'd said with a smile. Saving it. He must have sold it. To pay Eleanor's debt. To protect Margaret. To keep their life intact. Chapter 12 The Second Sacrifice Revealed. Margaret sat in silence for a long time. Then she noticed something else, a folded medical report tucked beneath the checkbook. Her name wasn't on this one. Thomas's was. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she unfolded it. Diagnosis. Progressive. Chronic. Her vision blurred. This wasn't something sudden. This wasn't something quick. This was something he had known about for years. Something that explained his fatigue, his pain. His quiet acceptance near the end. Something he had never told her. Her breath broke. Oh, Thomas. He hadn't just protected her from Eleanor. He had protected her from fear. From watching him slowly decline. From worrying every day. From carrying his pain alongside her own. He had chosen to suffer quietly. So she wouldn't have to. Chapter 13. Anger, love, and guilt. Grief hit Margaret like a wave. Not the sharp grief of losing him. But the heavy, complicated grief of realizing she never truly knew how much he gave. Anger rose too. Not at Thomas. At herself. How did I miss this? She whispered. How had she slept peacefully while he worked himself raw? How had she complained about small things while he carried mountains? How many times had she said, "You should rest," without understanding why he never did? Margaret curled inward, sobbing into the pillow. Love and guilt tangled painfully in her chest. Chapter 14 The Call She Never Wanted to Make. The letter to Eleanor sat on the kitchen table again. Margaret stared at the phone. Her sister's number was still saved. 17 years of silence, and now, a truth that couldn't stay buried. Her finger hovered. Shook. Then pressed call. It rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then, hello? Eleanor's voice was older. Cracked. Margaret closed her eyes. Eleanor, she said, voice trembling. It's me. Silence. Then a sob. I never thought you'd call, Eleanor whispered. Margaret's heart shattered. I know, she said quietly. And now I know why. Chapter 15 The Confession. They talked for hours. Painful hours. Truth spilled out in pieces. Eleanor had fallen into debt years ago, bad decisions, desperation, fear. She'd gone to Thomas because she was ashamed to face Margaret. Thomas had stepped in. Firm. Protective. Unyielding. He had paid what he could. Then worked more to pay the rest. And when Eleanor tried to involve Margaret, Thomas had shut it down. "I'll carry this," he'd told her. "You won't put this on her." Eleanor wept on the phone. "I hated him for it," she admitted. "Because he wouldn't let me hide behind her." Margaret listened, tears streaming. Chapter 16 Understanding the Man She Loved. When the call ended, Margaret sat in the dark kitchen. She finally understood. Thomas wasn't just her husband. He was her shield. Her anchor. Her quiet guardian. He had loved her in ways she never saw. Not loudly. But completely. Chapter 17. The morning after the truth. The next morning didn't feel like morning at all. Margaret woke before dawn, the house still wrapped in that soft gray quiet that only early hours bring. The space beside her in bed was empty, as it had been for 2 years now, but today, it felt heavier. Not lonelier. Heavier. The truth had weight. It pressed into her chest as she sat up slowly, feet touching the cold wooden floor. The house smelled faintly of old books and brewed coffee from yesterday, comforting, familiar, unchanged. And yet Margaret felt like someone new was waking up inside it. She shuffled into the kitchen, kettle in hand, movements deliberate and slow. As the water heated, she rested both palms on the counter and stared out the window toward the backyard. The bird feeder was empty. Thomas always filled it early. A soft ache passed through her. "I see you now," she whispered to the quiet house. Chapter 18. The Man Who Chose Silence. Margaret carried her tea to the living room and sat in Thomas's old chair. She had avoided it for years. It felt wrong, like trespassing. But today, she lowered herself into it carefully, hands resting on the armrests where his fingers had worn the wood smooth. She closed her eyes. And for the first time since his death, she didn't just remember Thomas as her husband. She saw him as he truly was. A man who chose silence instead of comfort. A man who absorbed pain so she wouldn't have to. A man who let himself be misunderstood by his own wife, because protecting her mattered more than being seen. How many times had she asked him if he was okay? Too few. How many times had he said, "I'm fine," when he wasn't? Too many. Her chest tightened. Love, she realized, wasn't always gentle. Sometimes it was quiet endurance. Chapter 19. The forgiveness she never knew she needed. Margaret stood and walked slowly toward the hallway. At the end of it hung a framed photo, Thomas laughing on the porch, sunlight on his hair, the kind of laughter that came from deep in the chest. She hadn't been able to look at it in a long time. Now she stopped. Her fingers touched the glass. "I forgive you," she said softly. The words surprised her. Not because he needed forgiveness. But because she did. "I forgive you for not telling me," she whispered. "And I forgive myself for not seeing." Her shoulders trembled. Love didn't fail here. It endured. Chapter 20 A Visit to the Bank. 2 days later, Margaret stood inside the small-town bank Thomas had used for decades. The young clerk looked up with polite confusion as Margaret placed the folder on the counter. "I need to understand what my husband did," Margaret said calmly. The clerk nodded and pulled up records. As numbers filled the screen, the truth became undeniable. Thomas had paid off Eleanor's debt completely. Not quickly. Slowly. Painfully. Over years. Working second jobs. Skipping comforts. Selling the watch. The clerk swallowed. "He never missed a payment," she said quietly. Margaret closed her eyes. Of course he didn't. Chapter 21 What Remains. Margaret walked out of the bank feeling hollow and full all at once. She went home and opened the wooden box again. This time, she wasn't afraid. She removed the ring, the letters, the folder. And at the bottom, a final note. Written shakily. If you're reading this, Maggie, I'm gone. I hope you're not angry. I hope you're living gently. Everything I did so you wouldn't have to carry it. You've carried enough. Live freely. Love openly. I'll be with you in the quiet mornings. Margaret pressed the note to her heart. I will, she whispered. I promise. Chapter 22. Rebuilding without guilt. Margaret didn't sell the house. Not yet. Instead, she changed it. She opened the windows. Let light in. Cleared rooms that had grown stagnant with grief. She started small. A new tablecloth. Fresh flowers. A repaired bird feeder. She placed the ring in a small frame with Thomas's photograph, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Love was not lost. It had transformed. Chapter 23, The Conversation with Eleanor. A week later, Eleanor came to Willow Creek. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one Thomas had written his letters at. No shouting. No accusations. Just truth. I don't expect forgiveness, Eleanor said quietly. I just needed you to know how much he protected you. Margaret reached across the table and took her sister's hand. He loved me, she said. And he loved you enough to hold you accountable. They cried. Not to erase the past, but to finally acknowledge it. Chapter 24, The Life He Wanted for Her. Margaret joined the town book club. Volunteered at the library. Started walking every morning, really walking, not drifting. People noticed. You seem lighter, someone said. She smiled. I am. Because she no longer carried questions. Only love. Chapter 25, A Legacy of Quiet Strength. On the anniversary of Thomas's passing, Margaret placed the ring beside his headstone. I know what you did now, she said softly. And I'll live in a way that honors it. A breeze passed through the cemetery. Birdsong. Quiet. Peace. Chapter 26, The House That Breathed Again. The house on Maple Street wasn't silent anymore. It held warmth again. Stories. Laughter when neighbors visited. Margaret stopped surviving. She started living. And every quiet morning, she felt him. If this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you that love isn't always loud, that sacrifice is often invisible, that healing comes slowly, but it comes, then this is your place. This is Quiet Morning Tales. And if you believe that it's never too late to understand love, that the people we lose still guide us, that even grief can lead to peace, please, subscribe. Not just for stories, but for the quiet moments that remind us we're not alone. Because sometimes, the deepest love is the one we only fully understand after it's gone.